Good afternoon. I'm Dave Ryan with the Lakeshore Chamber of Commerce, and welcome to a wonderful presentation from BP on their energy outlook for 2020 and beyond. COVID-19 has turned the world upside down, impacting our lives and our economy like never before. Schools, factories, retail establishments, sporting events, you name it, have all been impacted by COVID-19. Almost 1 year later, we are still fighting it. Today, we're going to hear from BP's chief U.S. economist, Mr. Michael Cohen, and he will provide us with insight as to BP's energy outlook in 2020 and beyond. Michael Cohen is chief U.S. economist and head of oil analysis in BP's economic and energy insights team. In this role, he's responsible for oil, transportation, and North American energy policy. Prior to joining BP in May of 2019, Mr. Cohen was Barclays' global head of commodities research. He worked for a decade in the public sector as an economist with the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the Department of Energy's Office of Policy and International Affairs, as well as 2 years in Paris as a senior member of the Oil Markets Division at the International Energy Agency. He graduated with a BS and a BA in Business Economics and a BA in Political Science from The Ohio State University and a master's in International Economics from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Please welcome Mr. Michael Cohen.
Thank you, Dave, and thanks to the Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to speak. It's an honor to speak to all of you. I thought that I would go through some of the key points that we tried to address in our energy outlook this year. And for BP, this is something that we've been doing on an annual basis for the last 10 years or so. But some of you may be more familiar with the statistical review of world energy, which has been called a kind of Bible for those of us that are trying to understand the current state of the energy system. And that's a backward-looking report that looks at the latest year. So we're very excited for next year to do the statistical review because it'll be quite a year. 2020 will be quite a year to be looking at. But the key points that I want to highlight today from the energy outlook relate to what we can expect in the world ahead. And normally we write this report in February and publish it in February. And two things happened this past year that made us delay hitting the green start button on that. The first one was the introduction of a new strategy and a reinventing process that's underway at BP with a new CEO, a new leadership team, and a new purpose and aims. And part of that strategy was was by and large influenced in a large part because of some of the key points that I'm going to highlight in the outlook. The second reason we put a pause on the release of the report is mainly because of the impact on COVID. And as the issues were mounting and seeing the spread beyond just China and into other parts of the world, we realized that this was going to be a really critical juncture in the overall evolution of the energy system. And so we needed to take that into account. So to just start off, if I could ask, we move to the next slide. I want to start out with some of the key things that we know about the energy system, then address this question of how COVID has affected the system and the picture for energy, then address some of the issues related to oil and the mobility revolution, then address the role that natural gas plays, and then what a net zero world looks like. And you're hearing more and more discussion of what net zero is in recent news articles, and seeing lots of countries pledging to this. And it's very possible we could see something similar here in the U.S. from a Biden administration. So if we move on to the next slide, there are three scenarios that we use to explore the energy transition. And these provide a wide range of possible outcomes, none of which we assign any more or less probability to. And so the goal here is to try to bound the outcomes and bound the way that the energy system could look, and ensure for us, because this outlook is informing our own strategy. So for us, it's a way to ensure that our strategy is robust to any of these possible outcomes. So 3 main scenarios: a business as usual scenario, a rapid transition scenario, and a net zero scenario. Rapid is shown here in orange in this chart. You can see that it comes well along the middle of the range of what a well below 2-degree scenario would look like. So 2-degree change in temperature from pre-industrial age. That would bring us in line with the Paris Accord. Now, there are 2 other scenarios here. One is one that is reflective of the fact that we need to reduce our emissions as quickly as possible, because even in the range of well below 2 degrees, we could still have very significant climate change. And so to bring it down to a level that's around 1.5 degrees 1.5 degrees Celsius, that is the line shown in blue. And then finally, the line shown in green is a business as usual scenario. And so this is one where, the same kind of technologies and policies and societal preferences evolve in a manner and speed that we've seen over the recent past. So that's a BAU scenario. The rapid scenario is one where we have to get to a 70% lower emissions profile for the energy sector by 2050. And then the third one is getting to a net zero emissions profile by the time we get to the mid-century in order to avoid a high probability of catastrophic climate change. So these are the scenarios that I'm going to talk through, and how the energy system evolves in each one of them is going to be extremely different. Second point I would make is that you can see there's a very wide band, right? All of these bands, whether it's the blue band or the purple band, can involve a very different makeup of energy in all of them. So you can be compliant with Paris and still have a very different outlook for oil or natural gas in that world and still be compliant. It's just a matter of what other levers you use in order to get to that emissions profile. So given all of this range of uncertainty, if we move on to the next slide, the goal that we came away from this is to try to understand, well, what are the key evolutions and what are the key characteristics that are unique in each scenario, and what are the key characteristics that are the same across all of the scenarios, and what can we learn from that? And so there are 3 key things that are the same, and that serves as the foundation of our core beliefs around how the energy system is going to evolve. So those core beliefs, first off, are number 1, that fossil fuel share of primary energy declines in all scenarios. That's what the chart on the left is showing. Second, that the share of renewables out of all primary energy increases across all scenarios. And third, the way in which we consume energy is increasingly done via electrification compared to where we are right now. So right now you get something like 23, 24% of the energy that you consume is via electricity. By the time we get into 2050, that share can almost double in that net zero scenario. And so there's a lot of interesting things that come about as a result of that, and so I'll get to that later on in the presentation. If we can move quickly to the next slide, what this shows is that those same 3 themes are present in the US context as well. And so we've done this slide and looked at this slide across all different countries, whether it's China, India, and I should mention, we have a large team, most of which are based in London, that all bring various specialties and levels of experience in terms of geography, fuels, and sectors. And so when we look at the way that the energy mix evolves, it's the same. It's very similar across all different geographies. So to move to the next slide, from a modeling perspective, we are largely making the energy mix change by using a carbon price to drive an increase in efficiency and to bring more advantage to lower carbon fuel sources. In reality, well, I should say in theory, it's okay to be using a carbon price to bring about that mix. In reality, it's going to be very different. And there's going to be either implicit carbon prices or mandates or bans on certain types of vehicles that imply a carbon price. And there's going to be certain times where companies, municipalities, regions of the world within states or within countries decide to impose a carbon price or impose a policy that basically becomes a shadow price for the goal that they're trying to achieve. So this is not meant to be precise, it's meant to be a modeling framework to understand how different fuels will perform in a different carbon environment where that externality is priced. So you can see in the chart on the left that carbon prices vary depending on whether we're in developed countries or developing countries, and it also varies depending on the scenario that we're in. The other point to make from the chart on the right is to show, just as I'm going to show in the next slide as well, how the energy mix changes in each of the scenarios. And you can see, obviously, in rapid and net zero, a very large share that goes into renewables. Second point is that the red bar here shown basically in the middle of that chart, that is the natural gas share, and that stays pretty stable throughout the time frame between 2018 and 2050. And then the one that shows the biggest decline across all of the scenarios, especially in rapid and net zero, is coal. And so that is as a result of it having the highest carbon intensity and falling out of the power mix, especially in developed economies. So to look at that last bar chart in a time series form, what we've done in the next slide is taken, not just looking at 2018 and 2050, but if we can move to the next slide, showing it all the way back from 1900 to 2050. And so for most of modern history, we've had basically one single dominant source of energy. In contrast, when you look beyond the dotted line here, over the next 20 years, in both the rapid and the business as usual scenario, the energy mix becomes much, much more diversified than what we've previously seen. And so here you see oil, natural gas, renewables, other non-fossil fuels, and coal are all providing significant shares of energy. And this matters for several reasons. Number one, that diversity of fuel means that it's the choice becomes much more centered in the customer. Customer has the choice rather than the increased or decreased availability of fuel in the overall determination of what the fuel mix looks like. The second point is that more diversified fuel mix also increases the need for integration across all different energy sources and carriers. And this is why electricity and later on hydrogen become much more important in the energy system than where they are today. The other thing to keep in mind here is that diversified fuel mix is a reason why the system becomes more localized as well. So trade shifts, you have trade in energy becoming less long haul, and more of the population in the world is getting their energy via localized form, especially in the power sector and possibly even in other sectors as well. Now, this has an implication for the resource owners of these fuels. So where oil demand or natural gas demand is falling compared to where they are right now, this is a world where those owners of the resources are competing even more to just ensure that their energy resources are produced in that world of falling demand. And so to reinforce the point here, the reason that this diversity, this new diversity of fuels matters is that all of this heightened competition increases the bargaining power that consumers have. And so therefore you see the rents that used to accrue to upstream producers shift to the consumer side. And that has implications for our strategy. It has implications for various regions in the world, and is a really important point to take away from how the energy system will evolve in the coming years. So, as I mentioned, if we can move on to the next slide, one beyond that, this experience that we're living through COVID is something that is deeply transformative. There's been obviously a lack of synchronization, a very unbalanced transition and transformation of all different economies as we've endured this crisis. There's been a very divergent outcome in terms of GDP growth and behavioral growth. And so at the point that we had to sort of freeze our analysis and give a view on what we think COVID might do to the economic outlook, we assumed that it would reduce the level of GDP by about 2.5% in 2025 and 3.5% by 2050. And these economic impacts were assumed to fall disproportionately on emerging economies, namely India, Brazil, and Africa. And it's those countries that were most exposed to the economic fallout from COVID. And so as a result, the impact fell by and large on these developing economies, and energy growth was falling, or is expected to fall by roughly the same amount as the decline in GDP growth. But the impacts of the virus are even more pronounced on oil demand because we have the behavioral effects, the reduction in jet fuel consumption, and the idea that we may be working from home with a higher frequency than where we were before the pandemic began. And so the economic profile changed markedly compared to where we were the last time we published the energy outlook. And so obviously there's the possibility of an even different case where we wouldn't have had a vaccine, for example, and so you would have seen, or at least the vaccine was delayed. And so we looked at a scenario like that in the part of this chart on the right-hand side. If you move on to the next slide, the reason I wanted to show this is some of you may be familiar with it, with seeing something like this in the past, this idea that there's going to be a group of population that still has very low energy access. 2.6 billion people remain without access to clean cooking. And the idea here is that there is this link between energy access and economic well-being and prosperity. And so the idea right now is that because COVID is going to make financing harder, and in some cases increase poverty, and also create strains on government finances, it's going to make it harder for people to be able to purchase that incremental energy. And instead, people are going to, by and large, revert to dirtier or cheaper fuels, and thus hindering any kind of transition for some period of time. But it is the case that there's going to be an idea that going forward, more of that population is going to need more energy. It's just a question of how much of that need for more energy is going to be offset by efficiency gains in the developed economies, and can that offset the increase in population? That's the open question. So if we move on to the next two slides, go one more, the question of how oil demand will be affected is extremely important as well. And so when we look at the oil sector, most of it is dominated by moves in terms of what we can expect from from the transportation sector. And so you can see the transportation sector is the blue bars in the chart on the left, cars, trucks, and non-road transport, including aviation and marine. You can see that accounts for roughly half of all oil demand. Now, going forward, when you look into 2050, much of the decline that you see in those bars is coming as a result of declines from the transport sector. Whereas when you look at the non-combusted share, so this is petrochemicals and use for plastics and things like that, fertilizers, things that are not combusted at the point of end use, that gray bar is not really changing in any of the scenarios compared to where we are today. So the big change in terms of the oil demand outlook is really coming from the transportation sector. And so the chart on the right shows that it's plateauing over the course of time between 2020 and 2035 in the BAU scenario, and then declining by roughly 2 million barrels a day in some of the deeper decarbonization scenarios. And so what drives that, if we can move to the next slide, is a sharp decline in the battery costs. We've already seen a 20% reduction in battery costs since 2010. We expect that to continue, though not at that same scale. And that drives, especially in countries that have emissions targets, like the EU, and we expect, or we have assumed in the rapid scenario in the US and other developed economies, that you're going to see a higher share of EVs in the overall mix. So electrification does make its way into Africa, but it takes a long time. It's making its way into China at a very high pace. And when you think about a place like India, half the liquid product demand there is with 2- and 3-wheelers, and those can be very easily electrified. So there are less ambitious policy targets in the BAU scenario compared to what you would see in the rapid and net zero scenario. And you can see that even by 2030, the amount of truck and car vehicle miles traveled is a very tiny share. So it's still less than, it's something like 10% of the vehicle kilometers traveled, vehicle miles traveled in all three of those scenarios is electrified. So we're not forecasting a very rapid take up in the near term. It means, however, that once we cross that threshold and electric vehicles become more cost competitive by the time we get into the middle of the decade, then EV sales and the share of the park, or the share of all the vehicles on the road, starts to increase. Now, how do we put all that in context, right? What the chart on the far right is showing is what is the electrification of the vehicle mix doing in terms of oil demand? What is the improvements, or what are the improvements in efficiency doing in terms of oil demand? And then finally, what is the overall increase in the need to travel in the developing world mainly and in other places? What is that doing to offset those two other trends? So the electrification component is in purple. You can see that in the different scenarios, dragging oil demand down. You can see in the green, that's the improvement in car efficiency. So the internal combustion engine has a significant way to go in terms of becoming more efficient. That's dragging down oil demand overall in this bridge between 2018 and 2050. And then the final component here is the navy blue bar. And that is basically meant to represent the increasing demand for travel. For places where motorization, or the share of people that have cars, or the ownership per capita, is still yet to increase substantially from where we are today. So if we can move to the next slide. So in this chart, what you can see on the left is the share of final energy demand in transport by the way in which they're traveling. And you can see even here that rail and aviation and marine are going to become a larger and larger share of the overall energy that is consumed within the transport sector as we move out to 2050. companies like ours and regulators are taking an increasing amount of scrutiny to look at ways in which the aviation and marine sector can be decarbonized. These are much harder to abate with existing technologies, and we need to see a significant scaling up and significantly more spending in these sectors, in these hard to abate sectors, in order to decarbonize them. And so in the scenario where we need to rapidly decarbonize, the role that biofuels plays, the roles that hydrogen plays in terms of fuel cell vehicles, and also with ammonia in the marine transport sector, and as well for biofuels in the marine transport, you can see shown, or you can see in the two charts on the right. Now, how does this all lump up, or how does this all square up when we look at total oil demand? If you move to the next slide, please. What this chart shows is something that some of you may be familiar with already. It shows the 3 oil consumption profiles, and then the black dotted line is meant to represent the oil supply profile at a constant price that you would have if you stopped investing in new oil and gas today. This chart is just showing oil, but if you stopped investing in new oil projects today, that's what would happen to the level of supply. And so what this chart is showing is that in no matter what scenario we are in, there's a significant gap that is opened up in terms of the gap between the demand profile and the supply profile. And so what we've done is we've tried to quantify how much, what is the rough amount of investment, incremental investment that's needed in order to bridge that gap. And so we estimate that there's still a significant amount of incremental investment. So anywhere between $9 to $20 trillion over the next 30 years, or roughly $250 to $800 billion per year, that is going to be needed in order to make that gap, in order to meet that gap. So the other thing that I would say is when you look at the oil and gas incremental investments and the investments that are needed in wind and solar in the chart on the right, you can see that compared to where we are today, 2013 to 2018 as an average, that's that little navy blue bar, you can see that in BAU, the level of investment doesn't really need to change very much at all. But in rapid and net zero, you need to scale down the level of investment in oil and gas in order to, to meet the gap in those cases. And in those 2 scenarios, you need to see a ramping up of wind and solar investment as well. And so there's a whole host of different issues related to the upstream gap, so to say. And what I would say is that when we look out forward, there's a significant amount of uncertainty. There's obviously a significant amount of proven reserves of oil, gas, and coal that are orders of magnitude 2-3 times higher than what could be emitted if we want to be in line with a Paris type scenario. And that is going to lead to certain types of oil and gas resources being stranded. There's going to be certain countries and geographies that are going to need to keep that oil and gas being produced for some significant amount of time. And so when you think about national priorities that certain countries have, non-combusted use of energy, or needs to address energy security concerns or geographical concerns, that's going to play a role in whether those resources are actually stranded or not. So there's been less attention to the amount of refining capacity and the effects of all of this on the downstream. And if we can go on to the next chart, what we show is that there's going to be a significant need for refining rationalization in the next several years. And some of that is happening as we speak. That what we're living through right now is a very sharp reassessment of the need for certain types of products And you're seeing closures of some refineries across the world that are least advantaged. The ones that are most advantaged in this world are ones where oil demand is continuing to grow, where you have product importers that have increasing amounts of demand that are needed. And I would say that the more resilient capacity tends to be in areas where there is higher complexity, so where there's conversion capacity, where you can produce lots of different types of oil products at a lower cost, and also in a world where there's feedstock advantage is also going to provide additional leeway for those refineries to continue to operate far into the future. There's areas and types of refineries that will be least resilient. Most of that is in developed markets, but not all of it. And some of it is, cannot take advantage of that lower cost feedstock, or doesn't have the level of complexity that other refineries around the world have. So if we can move on to the next slide. And just being cognizant of time, I'm going to go for another 5 or 10 minutes here, so I may skip a couple of these slides. But the point here is for natural gas, the orange line here is showing a much more resilient outcome, whereas in oil, that orange line in terms of gas consumption, if you can move on to the next, yeah, there you go, is coming down far sharply. Whereas for natural gas in the rapid scenario, it's basically ending up in 2050 roughly where it is in 2018. And there are a couple reasons for that. Number one, some of that gas is used for blue hydrogen, so steam methane reforming using the natural gas stream and then converting it into hydrogen, or also using natural gas and capturing it at the point at a power plant. And in addition, you're seeing the natural gas used as a source of as a source of incremental supply into power sectors in developing economies where there's significant leeway for a shift away from coal. And so that's what's shown in the chart on the next slide. You can see that natural gas in red stays pretty resilient across the whole entire time frame when you look at how it performs in the rapid scenario versus in the BAU scenario. So I'm going to cycle through these last couple of slides pretty quickly, but if we move on to what a net zero world looks like. So as I mentioned, the last scenario is one where we need to get carbon emissions from energy use to zero as quickly as possible. And this takes into account the fact that climate change and carbon emissions in the atmosphere is a stock, not a flow problem. What I mean by that is that every year we're adding more and more emissions into the atmosphere, and those cumulative amount of emissions are still going to cause climate change. And so if we need to reduce the probability of an overshoot into the middle of the coming century, then we need to get to a net zero profile on an annual basis as soon as possible. And so what this chart on the left is meant to show is the role that efficiency, the energy mix shifting, and then carbon capture, use, and storage are playing in that pursuit of getting to net zero. So we can move on to the next slide. What this raises a question of is what do you do with oil and gas in that net zero scenario? So what this shows is for at least gas, today it's accounting for something like 24 to 25% of primary energy today. But in the net zero scenario, it goes to about 10%. But there's a very wide band here. So the 10% is that black bar. And note that some of what's used here in net zero is gas used with CCUS. It's that hashed bar, or it's used to make blue hydrogen, and as shown in that blue bar. But again, a very wide range of uncertainty in terms of what can be expected in the whole wide range of IPCC or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change scenarios. And so that's what we're trying to do here is we're trying to say, well, look at all of these different IPCC scenarios. There's almost 100 of them, and they all look at the role that oil and gas plays, and they have various views on the role that oil and gas play, and various levers that are being used. And so what we do is look at one that is consistent with our forecast, and we come up with what's shown there in that black bar, but acknowledge that there's a very wide range of uncertainty and still can get to a net zero profile. Now, if we move to the next slide, oil, on the other hand, today accounts for something like 33% or so of primary energy. And as this chart here shows, it gets down to a little bit above 5%. So in terms of barrels of oil, it's 7% on that chart. It equates to around 25 million barrels a day. Today, obviously, consuming about 100 million barrels a day. And so the rest of the oil that's used in that world is used for non-combusted use and thus is not emitting at the point of use. But there's a very wide range there that can be anywhere from 11 million barrels a day to all the way up to 70 million barrels a day and still be consistent with still be consistent with a net zero profile. The final slide that I want to show here in terms of what does a net zero world look like is the role that CCUS plays. And this is something that's specifically important for the state of Illinois. There are lots of opportunities in this state. And so what this chart is showing is a very wide range of CCUS, and we're not relying on it in a big way in the blue dot. The blue dot is meant to show our net zero scenario, but in the IPCC scenarios, it tends to get leaned on pretty significantly. Now, the final point I want to make is to address the danger that, if we can move on to the next slide, or basically just address the fact that over the next several years, there is a very likely possibility that we could be delayed in getting onto that path of a rapid transition. And so if we take as given that there is a finite carbon budget, in other words, we have continuing high levels of emissions in the near term that have to be compensated for at some later date. And that's what the red bar coming under the rapid bar is meant to show. So we carry on our merry way, not doing anything and along the BAU scenario in green, and then suddenly realize in 2030, okay, we need to catch up. We need to catch up back to where we were in rapid. And so that's what this stylized example is meant to show, is that what is the emissions profile that's needed in order to do that. So to go to the next slide, what this is meant to show is what does energy consumption look like in that world where we have to catch up. So if we take as given that a rapid scenario, we've basically expended all of the energy efficiency and switching options that are possible. And the only other way to reduce emissions at the speed that is needed is to just reduce consumption. So by the time we get into 2030, we're consuming something like 610 exajoules of energy per year on a global basis. And in order to get back onto that red pathway, in terms of emissions in the chart on the left, the only other way to do that is to reduce consumption, or in other words, rationing. So the point here is that the longer that we continue along this unsustainable pathway of business as usual, and the longer that we delay any kind of decisive action, the more costly and disruptive that eventual pathway is going to be. And that's the key point with this stylized, delayed, and disorderly scenario, is that nobody wants to have to ration their use of energy. Nobody wants to have to be told by government or society or whatever, or priced in a way that you can no longer take that vacation 3 times a year, and instead you can only do it once. These are the kinds of things in terms of rationing that we would have to endure. And so I think it's important to understand, first of all, the wide ranges of uncertainty in these scenarios. Number 2, that there are certain commonalities across these scenarios that have driven the decisions that we have made. And there's a significant, and finally, that there's a real cost to delay. And it makes more sense to assume and take some of that cost and engage in action now than to have to deal with the cost of inaction at some point that we don't know when in the future. And so I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Michael, thank you very much. That's a lot of information.
Yes.
I have a question for you. Indiana is a manufacturing, coal, agricultural state with wind and solar in the energy mix. What are some of the easier changes that you have seen that could make more economic sense, that could be taken on to improve our greenhouse gas emissions?
So I think the easiest gain is in the power sector. You know, the power sector in the U.S. has evolved significantly as a result of low natural gas prices in the last several years, and that fuel switching, you know, has led to a pretty substantial reduction in carbon emissions and carbon intensity going forward, and I expect that trend to continue. I think the threat to that is that in the next 2 years, you know, looking into a crystal ball, of course, you know, there's a significant possibility that we could see higher natural gas prices, and that will mean that coal will penetrate, or at least the rate of coal retirements and the rate of coal coming into the power sector, coming out of the power sector and being retired is going to slow if natural gas prices are high. So that's a risk. I would say the other thing generally in terms of, you know, we have clean energy standards that are being used. We have transparent market signals as renewables continue to come down. They're going to penetrate into the power sector, but there's going to be a need for other balancing fuels, including nuclear, including hydro in the U.S., including natural gas in order to balance that intermittency.
Okay, we have a question from one of our sponsors. Just a minute. I'm going to come back to him in just a minute, but there's a question also about coal consumption. In 2019, coal consumption decreased to its lowest level since 1964. Electric power generation via coal dropping to its lowest level in 42 years. Natural gas has displaced much of the electric generation from retired coal plants. Do you foresee wind and solar ever replacing natural gas and electric generation?
So only in the very rapid decarbonization scenario is there a substantial incremental displacement of natural gas by renewables power. How that works is going to rely on significant amounts of grid infrastructure upgrading, batteries, and a grid that can handle that level of intermittency. It is possible, and our technologists inform us and help us make the call with more conviction in that rapid scenario that is a possibility. But in the BAU scenario, for example, it's you know, the level of displacement of natural gas is not as much. What I would highlight though is that in that rapid decarbonization world, more of that natural gas is, first of all, more of the gas is arguably coming from renewable sources, so biomethane. And the other point that I would make is that there's a significant role, you know, 5–10% of hydrogen in that world, and gas is being used for different purposes, not necessarily in the power sector at that point.
Okay. Victor, do we have a question? Yes. Mike?
Yes.
Yeah.
You have a question, Michael?
Yes, you're talking to me, Michael Urimovich?
Yes, I am, from Manhattan Mechanical Services.
Yeah, all right, thanks. Michael, great presentation. My company primarily provides service to the oil refineries, so I guess I need to diversify. The future doesn't look that good. But you showed some different scenarios. What is, looking into your crystal ball again, what scenario do you think is the most realistic over the next 10 years?
So we did a two-part poll when we first released this report, and for certain engagements that we've done it again in different geographies, and the question revolves around this: what do you think is the scenario that's most that is most likely to happen, and what is the scenario that you think is that you want to happen? So which is likely versus which would you like to happen? And I would say that the answer to that generally is along the lines of 40% or so say that they would like net zero and rapid to happen, but thinking that, and the balance being for the rest of the scenarios. And then when you think about which is likely, it's still a significantly high share of people responding as rapid. For me personally, I think that a BAU scenario is most likely in the US context in the next sort of 5 to 10 years. But I think that as we move beyond that 5 to 10 year time frame, I think technology and policy and the sheer knowledge of what we are facing in terms of the effects of climate make a rapid scenario more likely. So I guess the answer is, I think the most likely scenario, unfortunately, is delayed and disorderly.
Thank you.
Michael, I have a question. With refinery changes and less carbon refined fuels, how will this impact the fertilizer world if there's not as much sulfur produced during the refining process?
That's a great question. I don't know that I've fully thought through that. I would expect that there would already be some changes in terms of the supply and demand mix for fertilizers. And I would expect that there's still going to be some role, especially in the medium term, for those heavier barrels or higher, sourer barrels. And those will continue to be used and prized in various ways, forms, and shapes, depending on the overall demand mix. But I don't have a great answer for that, partly because I don't consider myself an expert in the makeup of fertilizers. But I would suspect that on balance, you're still going to have those higher sulfur fuels. It's just that the geographical source of those higher sulfur and sour fuels may be refined in places where the overall complexity means that refinery is continuing to operate. Whereas in a place like Venezuela, let's say, or in a place like certain crudes in Africa or in Latin America, the overall pressure on the refining system in those places may mean that those refineries are no longer operating. So I don't have a great answer for you on that, frankly.
This may be along the same lines, but I'll try this. BP has set lofty goals of reaching net zero by 2050 or sooner. In 2013, BP completed the state's largest economic development project in history, the $5 billion project at the Whiting Refinery using heavy crude in Canada. Now, a few years later would seem BP is radically switching gears with an effort to become carbon-free in their oil and gas production processes. How would net zero impact the Whiting Refinery's production of oil and gas?
So I think that overall, there's a significant level of uncertainty. And we have put, as I've said, and those ranges of uncertainty for the role that oil and gas will play, as I said, was, even in the net zero scenario, anywhere from 11 to 70 million barrels a day. So amid the uncertainty, we have conveyed to investors and conveyed to the general public our aims and ambitions, and as well our 2030 targets in terms of the level of oil supply that we expect to be within our remit or within our ownership by the time we get to 2030. And so the role that a refinery can play, I mean, we're obviously making decisions around the entire downstream footprint as we speak, and as we've already continued to talk about in terms of the most recent earnings season and the closure of and conversion of our Australian refinery. So there are opportunities for those refineries in terms of being producers of other products, serving as terminals, and there's obviously a transition that we see as underway, and the question is, what is the pace and speed of that, given the underlying dynamics of the market? And so you all, well know the built environment in the United States is one where it may take a very long time for electrification to start to reduce oil demand significantly in this country. And in the meantime, there's a significant amount of incremental demand in externally and in especially in developing economies. So I would say that the complexity of the Whiting refinery and the system that we have across all of our portfolio is going, obviously, as we've said publicly, is going to be looked at in the coming years, and the things that are most advantaged and most sort of fit for the future of oil demand are the refineries that we think are continue to need to be in our portfolio, and I think part of our aims and ambitions are that we are doing what we can within our own portfolio, but we're also trying to do what we can to get the world to net zero as well. So anyway, I hope that sort of answers your question.
And this may be along the similar lines. Do you see developing countries investing in clean energy, since they attribute much of the accelerated energy growth coming from developing countries?
Yeah, so I think, broadly speaking here, you look at a country like India, looking at a country like China, the challenge that they face in terms of decarbonization is markedly different than the challenge to decarbonize in the US or in Europe. And I think, frankly, we are advantaged in that we have an energy profile that is not growing significantly. And so then it's just a question of are the right incentives in place to deal with what's already in place in the energy mix that we have that's already in place. Whereas in a place like China or India, energy demand is growing by leaps and bounds every year, and there's no way that you're going to have sufficient amount of renewable investment that can meet that entire incremental power demand. And so in those cases, natural gas steps in to play a role in that mix. So, just in terms of the challenges that they face, we've seen, pledges across China. We've seen in other countries in Asia. We're seeing it in Europe. New pledges around achieving a net zero profile, and I expect that as we get closer and closer to the next, to the next big climate meeting, that you're going to see more and more of those pledges. The question is, can it be done? With given policies and with given technologies, and I think the speed of it is going to accelerate in certain sectors, and because of the sheer decline in technology costs for renewable energy, and so it's a question of being able to scale that up in a big way. And in certain cases, it's not going to scale, and in other cases, I think it will.
question. How is BP positioning on the feedstock for biofuel renewables? Is there enough going to be produced domestically, or will there be a need to have it imported? If so, what percentage of mix?
So we didn't model the broader trade of biofuels in our outlook. What I would say is that we do take into account the sort of food energy nexus into our modeling. And when you think about the policy landscape going forward, I think it's not as, I would say it's a little bit less likely that we could see going forward an increasing renewables, an increasing biofuels requirement in the transport sector. Frankly, from my own opinion, I think it's going to be difficult to see something like that in the policy landscape. But when you think about the opportunities that we've already seen in terms of renewable diesel, the opportunities that for a lot of these refineries seeing that as an opportunity for them, and also the opportunity in sustainable aviation fuels, there's a significant role, as I showed in that other slide, that those biofuels can play. But there is going to be tension around whether that crop and whether that agricultural area is used for food or for the purposes of these energy stocks, and we try to take that into account.
All right. BP is switching its energy portfolio, so they must be investing in many new forms of energy. Northwest Indiana is experiencing exponential growth. Would you say alternative energy is equally economic with traditional power at this time?
Sorry, I missed the last part of that. What was that?
Would you say alternative energy is equally economic with traditional power at this time?
So it just depends on the geography, right? And it depends on the landscape of the market mechanisms and whether that is the case. I would say if you look at in the West Coast, not just in California, but in the West Coast in general, you're seeing increasingly cost competitive renewables. You're seeing it in wind in Texas, and broadly speaking across the US, you're seeing renewables displacing natural gas in the power mix. So I wholeheartedly believe that it is, and the data show that it is cost competitive compared to traditional sources of power. I think the question becomes one more related to where do we go from here? Obviously, as we get into higher and higher rates of penetration of renewable sources of energy, the cost to deploy that marginal megawatt hour of renewable energy becomes more and more, because the cost of managing that intermittency becomes higher. And so there's technologies that can deal with that. There's demand response that can deal with that, and there's regulation and market design that is already being developed to be able to deal with some of these issues. So yes, I do think it's possible, but obviously every geography is going to be different, and there's going to be not just in your region, but in every region, there's going to be vested interests that will try to keep the status quo. And we see that across the world, across all sectors and across all fuels. And that's one of the challenges that we face for decarbonizing.
Michael, we are about out of time, and I sincerely want to thank you and thank BP for making this presentation, enlightening us as to the energy outlook for 2020 and beyond. And I'd like to thank Manhattan Mechanical Services, Mead out of Chicago, and also BP. And I have one last question for you. You're a graduate of Ohio State University, and I went to Indiana University. Who were you picking this week?
Well, I just hope they play. I don't want any more cancellations. But yeah, my loyalty is clear.
Michael, thank you for everything.
Thanks,
we appreciate
Dave.
it.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.